Most Americans probably know the name U.S.S. Constitution or her nickname Old Ironsides, and at least some have an idea about the role played by this ship and her sister ships in the foundations of the American nation. The history of these ships is quite interesting, and I'd fully recommend looking into it beyond just the battles and major operations these ships were in. The social, economic, and political background to the story of how they were created and used is quite fascinating. Welcome to the 311 Griffin YouTube channel. I recently had the chance to visit the U.S.S. Constitution, which is the oldest commissioned naval warship still afloat. I am also currently reading the book 6 Frigates by Ian Toll, which covers the history of the early U.S. Navy. Constitution and all the American heavy frigates are fascinating vessels. It all started with the need for warships in the New World and a Quaker shipbuilder named Joshua Humphreys. Humphreys, serendipitously, worked as an apprentice for another shipbuilder and took charge of that operation when his master died. He was chosen to design the original 6 heavy frigates and decided to make them a little differently than contemporary ships of the time. He knew that America could not build enough ships to go toe-to-toe with the Royal Navy, and so his idea was to build ships that would be able to outrun and outsail any heavier ship, and to catch and outgun any equally sized ship. At the time, the design was controversial, to the point that many other shipbuilders fought against the design, and some of the other people involved with the construction of some of the ships decided to change the design, contrary to orders. Humphreys also insisted on certain parts of the ship being made from live oak. This added time, cost, and difficulty to the construction, but live oak is much denser, heavier, and harder to work than other woods typically used in the ship construction of the time. The U.S. heavy frigates were quite effective in the quasi-war with France, and somewhat so in a conflict with Tripolitania in North Africa. They were repeatedly taken in and out of service depending on American priorities, whether we needed to protect merchant ships or whether we needed to save money more. As tensions with England mounted, the ships were once again readied for action. Much can be said about the actions on both sides of the Atlantic that led up to the War of 1812. England was at war with France and did not want American ships supplying France with resources. America relied heavily on exports for income. Additionally, England had a massive navy to man in many parts of the globe and were concerned about their Navy sailors defecting and then taking jobs aboard U.S. ships. England began stopping U.S. merchant ships and pressing sailors into English service. In some cases, they were recovering British sailors, but England got quite aggressive in their efforts to do this. There's much more to the story, but on the waves, things like the battle between the HMS Leopard and the U.S.S. Chesapeake in 1807 nearly led the nation to war. The battle here is in quotes because the Chesapeake was completely unprepared to fight and didn't really put up much of one. That particular incident led partially to the embargo of 1807, which was basically an abysmal failure for Thomas Jefferson. The English continued to increase pressure on the American coast and American shipping. In 1811, the HMS Guerriere stopped the U.S.S. Spitfire, a brig, and impressed a sailor from that ship. This event escalated tensions quite sharply once again. The U.S.S. President, one of Constitution's sister ships, was out looking for Guerriere or other HMS blockading ships. This led to an encounter between U.S.S. President and HMS Little Belt, a sloop of war. Accounts still disagree on what exactly happened in this encounter. Both ships asked for the other to identify herself. Both claimed they were first to ask. Neither ship answered the question, and both say the other started the conflict. At any rate, it was basically the inverse of what happened during the Leopard Chesapeake, with the English ship taking the damage, although in this case the ships were greatly mismatched because the President was quite a bit bigger than the Little Belt. This affair solidified England's stance that they had the right to stop and search any vessel belonging to America as part of their war against Napoleon. There's much more to the story, but America declared war by an extremely narrow margin, the narrowest margin that America has ever declared war. And this was also the first time that America as a nation had declared war. And this was mostly based on maritime issues. The declaration was signed by President Madison on the 18th of June, 1812. During the war, the massive English Navy eventually maintained an effective blockade against the U.S. coastline and took more enemy merchantmen by far than the U.S. Navy took. The decisive single-ship battles that are celebrated in the U.S. did little to change the outcome of the war, yet they do showcase the effectiveness of the U.S. heavy frigates and the wisdom of Joshua Humphrey's designs. The Constitution decimated the HMS Guerriere on 19th of August, 1812. The U.S.S. United States decimated the HMS Macedonian on the 25th of October, 1812. The U.S.S. Constitution then took the HMS Java in December. The HMS Shannon took the U.S.S. Chesapeake in a bloody conflict on the 1st of June, 1813. Of note is the fact that the Chesapeake was not of the same design as the larger heavy frigates. It was a little bit smaller. On the 28th of March, 1814, 2 U.S. ships were taken during the Battle of Valparaiso, a smaller frigate and a sloop. The only one of the original true heavy frigates that was lost by the U.S. during the war was the U.S.S. President, taken by a British squadron while President was trying to break out of the blockade of New York Harbor. However, my favorite account of the U.S.S. Constitution describes how Isaac Hull and his crew escaped 5 British ships in a 57-hour chase that involved towing the ships during calm weather and kedging the ships forward. Hull was attempting to rendezvous with 5 ships in Rogers' squadron and had seen 5 sail the day before. He closed the distance thinking it was Rogers' American squadron. When the next day dawned, the Constitution was almost in the midst of the HMS Africa, a 64-gun battleship, and frigates HMS Aeolus, Belvidera, Guerriere, and Shannon. Additionally, there was a brig and a schooner in the British squadron. 2 of the frigates were nearly within cannon range on the Constitution's lee. 1 frigate was 5 to 6 miles astern. The rest were further astern, hull up from the masthead. The Constitution made sail and began fleeing, and the British joined the chase. The sea became becalmed, however, and Hull put his crew to the boats to tow the ship. The British put their boats into the water, but sent most of them to the Shannon, which allowed the Shannon to start gaining on Constitution. The crew of the Constitution then began the process of kedging, hauling 2 anchors forward in the ship's boats and dropping them, then pulling the ship forward by reeling the anchors in with the capstans. Constitution also pumped a large amount of fresh water overboard. Many times during the long chase, it seemed inevitable that Constitution would have to either strike or fight to the death. Shots were exchanged from time to time, though no damage was done by either side. On the second day of the chase, light breezes popped up, which barely gave the ship's steerage. The crew was ordered to loft buckets of water into the tops to pour onto the sails. This allowed them to utilize the wind more effectively. At one point, Constitution had to tack and pass well within range of the Aeolus, who could have attempted to fire on the U.S. ship. Presumably, she did not fire for fear of slowing her own headway down. By midday, the breeze was freshening, and the Constitution, which Hull had ordered cleaned and overhauled recently, began leaving the British squadron behind. A 2 o'clock log entry registered a speed of 12.5 knots. Later in the evening, a heavy rain squall approached. The crew took in studding sails, royals, skysails, topgallants, and the flying jib, and then reefed the mizzen topsail and the spanker. However, once the squall passed over them and blocked the view from the British ships, Hull ordered the crew to make all sail. At dawn, the final day of the chase, it was clear they were out of danger. This situation could have played out much differently. The commander could have struck his colors and given up. He could have, and would have, according to all accounts, fought until the ship was sunk. The crew did, to a degree, despair during the chase, but they could have fully given themselves over to their assumed fate. The British ships could have been more trim and faster, or possibly handled better. In the end, the Constitution narrowly avoided being sunk or captured near the very beginning of the war. Instead, she escaped through ingenuity, perseverance, and courage to fight another day. Because she escaped, she was able to later take Guerriere, Java, Pictou, a 14-gun schooner, Cyane, a 22-gun 6th rate, and Levant, a 20-gun 6th rate, along with many merchant ships. The capture of Cyane and Levant is notable for two reasons. One, after capturing the first ship, Levant attempted to flee, but Constitution overtook the smaller ship. Second, after the battle, Constitution had 12 32-pound carronade balls lodged in the hull, but none penetrated. Obviously, there's much more to the story of the Constitution's career and why the Constitution is still a naval vessel, but I will sum it up by just saying that Constitution and her sister ships represented more than just a fighting force for America. They did little to change the outcome of the war in the end, but they gave the fledgling nation something to be proud of, and they gave the British Navy, that were the masters of the seas, all of the seas at the time, something to think about and something to fear. These ships, though small in number and not built the same way that contemporary ships were built at the time, changed the way navies thought and operated. And they gave America a lot to look forward to and helped America see that there was the potential for them to go up against the largest, best navy in the world and stand a chance. Obviously, America had already done what seems like the impossible by winning the American Revolution and establishing their own independence and their own nation. But to have them do it again just a few short years later really changed the face of the globe, and I think it changed it for the better. So this is what the Constitution represents to me, and this is why I've always wanted to go visit the Constitution. First and foremost because I just find fully rigged ships fascinating, and I find the age of sail fascinating, and sailing warships are fantastic to look upon. The Constitution wasn't fully rigged when we went to see it. There were a lot of masts and yard arms and spars and rigging that was missing, but it was still very fascinating to see the ship and see the quarters that the crew would be working in and living in, and just to see kind of how the ship was put together and get a first-hand glimpse of the heavy frigates that made up the early U.S. Navy. These ships are absolutely fascinating. So I'm glad I got to go, and hopefully this is interesting to people that are watching this video, and I thank you for watching. Happy Treason Day.